Hi everyone, I'm Maritza Johnson. I am the director of University of San Diego's Center for Digital Civil Society, and I am super excited to be here today participating in the BIML in the Barn series. My talk is called Data Privacy and Machine Learning. The theme of it will be defining and redefining our relationship with data. Never before has the power and promise of data been so palpable. If you think about our daily lives, so many of the great themes that you're seeing right now really have a strong current around data being a big part of it, telling us more about our world, telling us about our lives, kind of shaping our lives even at this point. So if you think about the situation with the pandemic, we're checking in hourly, daily on new tables, new models. All of this is data-driven. If you look at finance, so much of it in fintech is driven by data. Also in our personal lives, we're increasingly installing Internet of Things devices in our homes, and we're really kind of setting a new standard for our digital selves. Now, as builders in this space, people who work with the data, I want to ask you a question in terms of all of this excitement around the power and the promise of data. Let's talk a little bit about kind of the shadow that's underlying it, which is most of the data that we're most interested in working with is about people. We're interested in collecting data about people, understanding their patterns, understanding how to shape their lives. And as a person who works as a builder in this space, my question to you is, are you right with data? So do you feel like your relationship with the data that you work with in your job, do you feel like you have a productive, healthy relationship, an understanding with the data, where it comes from, and the people that are represented by it? And so really in this talk, I want to talk with you as a builder about what is our relationship with data? What could it be if we are interested in this future that we're building, where we really get a chance to live up to the power and promise of data? What does that relationship need to be? And how can we design it and craft it so that we have a healthy, flourishing one, both with as digital citizens, with the data that we kind of coexist with in our lives, but really as builders for the data that we're working with. Now, I've spent a ton of time talking with people about data. I talk with them about privacy. I've spent hours in the field listening to people share their stories about technology in their lives, how their devices change it. One of the things that I found that's really interesting about talking with people about data and privacy, the word privacy doesn't always resonate. Even the word data doesn't always resonate. It actually takes effort to get that conversation going. But once you get it going and once you find the right words that resonate with the person you're talking to, there's a lot to listen to. They have new questions. They have long lingering questions that they've never gotten answers to. And if you watch for their affect, there's a lot of emotion to it as well. There's this general feeling that there's a lot that they don't understand, that there's a lot more going on behind the scenes that they might not know, and even, I'd say at times, a little bit of shame, feeling like they should be doing more, but they don't know what that is. As a result of the work that I've done, talking with people about data, talking about privacy, hearing about their concerns about safety, I found myself in a handful of jobs where I'm working as part of a product team, listening to folks designing new products and new services, where they want to know, based off my experience, what are the privacy implications of the thing that they're working on? What are people going to have questions about? How do you prepare so that people know, is this going to be something sensitive? Will people think this is creepy? One of the things that really struck me in the work that I've done, both listening to people talk about their data, trying to figure out, how do we build things that people need, build things that are useful, while also working as a part of a product team to, better understand and really kind of shape product decision making based on what I'd seen, is I feel like there's a lot more to do. I would say, based on my experience of hearing the sort of questions that people have, we don't really have that kind of strong relationship between the people who are building and the connection with the data that they're working with, or having a connection to the people that you're building for. So that's been maybe the past, let's say, 10-ish years of my career, really thinking hard about the people behind the data, thinking about how people think about their data. And right now, I think there's a big question in the air. What more is there to say about data privacy in 2021? And I think this is a particularly interesting question to me because in this slide, I'm wanting to capture that there are kind of two points of views roughly that I kind of hear this question coming from. One is, I'll characterize this as kind of like the eager puppy dog. It's like, haven't we kind of shown enough of the power and promise of data that, we're doing good now? For a while we were kind of like taking out a check that maybe we couldn't cash yet, and we're collecting a lot of data because we knew that we were onto something. And now, we did good, right? I'm like, no, not yet. The other one's a little more kind of goofy, and that is, look at all this great stuff we have. Dear privacy advocate, aren't you happy yet? Look at all this great stuff. Can't we say now that like on this great scale of we've done all these good things and there are some bad things that could happen, don't the good things outweigh the bad things? We've done enough, right? No, no, we haven't. So what I really wanted to say is, from these questions, like I said, I've worked with product teams where folks are asking me, have we done enough? What could we do? What are the implications? In the face of kind of this growing trend around machine learning and data science and artificial intelligence, I have had folks ask me in the past couple of years, well, what's new and different right now? So is the conversation really the same? Are there new things to be thinking about? And to me, the thing that is markedly different is that I think there are a couple of things. So one, it's that now that we have better models and more products where we are shipping systems that are AI enabled or have machine learning models built into them, we're seeing data being used in just like the scale of which is it's far greater, and also the speed at which things are deployed is far greater. So there's just more things out there. Because there's more out there, I would say that these people I'm talking about, having conversations with them about their data, they're having more experiences that feel a little uncanny, and it makes them wonder, how do these products work? So when you buy this smart home assistant and you put it in your house, and you can be talking, and if you say, hey Siri, then it turns on and starts to answer you. Well, then what happens to all those other words I'm saying that aren't just hey Siri? Or when hey Siri responds correctly to my husband's voice, but not always to my voice. Well, why is that? I have a pretty good command of the English language, so why is it that Siri is not understanding me as clearly as my husband? So I feel like just in general, like the thing that is different with machine learning and AI now that these are embedded in our products, we have the same privacy problems that we've never kind of taken the time to satisfactorily address. And the thing that is different is now we have people asking questions about what's going on, and we still don't have good answers. And so this is where I think as builders, we really need to focus on how do we rehabilitate this dysfunctional relationship with data that we have as individuals and that we have as builders. This dysfunctional relationship as it exists, it cannot bear the weight of our hopes and dreams for what we're going to do. So I just made a huge claim, and for the rest of the talk, I want you to bear with me and play with that reality for me. So let's take this as true, and let's play with what this means. So instead of kind of quibbling over to what degree is Maritza onto something, let's say, the state of things, it can't bear the weight of where we're going. So actually, and this is the point where people actually kind of start to hope that I might have some magical solution for them. It's like, all right, so you just told me that you've spent 10 years thinking about how people think about data. Surely you've learned something, right? The thing I've learned is that there is no pixie dust. So I like to work in problem spaces where everybody wants the pixie dust, and it's just not what's available. So human-centered security, human-centered privacy, research ethics. These are all, great things where wouldn't it be great if we had pixie dust? But we sure don't. Now, what I just said is a little bit depressing, but I want to kind of turn a corner to something that's more exciting. So the great thing about what we're talking about is we're builders, right? The things that we have problems with, people like us built them. People like us continue to build. We go to our job every day and we build more. And just as easily as we built the things that we've already built, if easily is the word you would use, we could decide to build things differently, right? So this image here, it's this crazy palm tree that exists in the totally artificial island out in the ocean, and it should not exist. Engineering is amazing. There's so much that we could do. all it takes is people like us to decide that we're going to do things differently. So keep that in mind. I guess this is another thing that I'll ask you to hold with you. Be inspired to think a little bit broader for this space. So let's bring things back to BIML. All models are wrong, some of them are useful. So if you have quibbles with this, the generic model for ML, that's okay. It serves the purpose for the talk. And it's actually, I found it really handy. So if we're builders in the machine learning space, we're working in data science, we're creating models, roughly you can imagine that the work that we do is split into these different phases. Now, depending on what your actual job title is, depending at the point, what point in a project you are, you might find yourself in different spaces. And the thing that I want to point out is that, as a computer scientist, I would say one of the things that I really learned is that abstractions are useful. The digital world and computing world is so incredibly complex that you can't possibly, find your way toward a solution if you don't put up some boundaries and kind of make assumptions, figure out what your problem space is, and go forth and find a solution that works within that space. And the thing that I want to encourage you all to do is to think at times, get some inspiration to sometimes think about those boundaries that we've put up as being permeable for a little bit. So at times, once you get started in thinking about, the problem that you're solving, it's really easy to get into solutioning mode. And as soon as you go to solutioning mode, you have to start thinking, right, what are my assumptions? What are the things that I'm going to anchor on? What are the things I will take for granted as true? And then you go and you work within that space. So that's what we're doing in each of these little in each of these kind of elements here. But I really want to encourage us for thinking about, this rehabilitation of our relationship with data. What would happen if we step outside of the boundaries that we've put, these neat little boxes that we do our work in, and take a broader look? So take a step back to think hard about problem framing. Take a step back sometimes and think about problem finding. Are we asking the right questions? Before jumping into this, I would say kind of that cozy little playground that we like to spend our time in, which is problem solving. Solutioning is super fun, but at times we really need to draw it back and think more broadly about how are we framing the problem, how are we finding our problems, and how are we staying connected to that context as we work. So what I'm wanting to do for this talk is to encourage you as a builder, as you are doing your work, to find opportunities to ask new questions. So at times when you're finding that you've made certain assumptions about the work that you're doing, that you've made certain assessments, when things are, when you're seeing headlines wondering about like, how did it happen that a certain team, a product team, made this product that ended up with all these negative headlines that is maybe like contributing to this broad environment of feeling like there's a techlash, stop and think through like, well, maybe they made some early kind of decisions that shaped the problem in a certain way that led to a certain solution. So if we all knew that context, we would maybe kind of assess things differently. But really giving yourself an opportunity to always take a step back and ask simple questions in the context of the work that you're doing. And so I just love this quote, and I love the idea of beautiful questions. So I'm wanting to ask you all in your own work as a builder to stop and think through what would be some more beautiful questions that you could bring into your day job that might inspire you to do your work differently. And so in the context of, you're working as an ML practitioner and you're thinking about what model to build, thinking about, well, what problem is it that we're trying to solve? Who has this problem? Whose data are we going to use to start looking into solutions? Whose life will be changed or job will be made easier when we have a model that works? Within that context, do we believe that we can design a satisfactory solution? So what does it mean for us to design a good solution here? Also, of course, taking the time to think through, well, might this approach introduce other problems? You put your finger in the hole here and then the water stops, but like, where does it squirt out elsewhere? So making sure, you're building over here, what's going on at other points in the system. Even thinking through, well, are there any alternatives that would suffice just as well? Sometimes when we're talking about solving technical solutions, we get so excited, like I said, in the solutioning space, that we forget to take a step back to wonder, do we need technology in this point? Do we need a model? Would a simpler approach be better? Would a simpler approach be more satisfactory? Assuming that you're going to continue forward, that you have an idea of something to build, that it would solve the problem, that it would make a positive impact in people's lives, stopping to ask, well, for the system, for at the point of deployment, do we believe that we will be able to detect an adverse event? So if something goes wrong that you didn't account for at the point of design, will you know? Do you have a functioning feedback loop so that you could go back, understand, and then fix it later? And really reaching toward this broader question of, well, how will we know when adaptations are needed? I think one of the great exciting things about working in data is that, as you get new data, you do things differently. You update your priors, right? So as you're building a system and you're deploying it, what is your mechanism for updating your priors? So now I want to get into a little bit of storytelling around experiences that I have had related to working in a product space, talking with people about their data, that helped to kind of revisit assumptions and assessments that folks on the team were making that I think meaningfully changed the direction that our decisions went. And what I'm wanting to do is kind of share this with you all as a bit of a highlight of, what's the lesson learned here. So one point that I want to make is, as you're a person working in the space of machine learning, as you're thinking about the model that you're building, there are kind of like two components that go into the work. It's the data that's coming in and the algorithm that you're going to use to figure out what the model is. And the thing that I want to highlight here is that when you're thinking about data being collected, data being rendered, to think hard about, well, what were the steps that were taken to go from messy real life experience into neat lines in a table, neat entries in a database, neat lines in a spreadsheet? What transformation had to happen? And think about what might have been lost. So once upon a time, I was working on a product team, and the task we were given was to take some number of millions of users through a consent dialogue. So typical EULA sort of experience where you have, as the company, information that you need the person to acknowledge having read, and then you give them two buttons, usually that say, I agree, or I don't. At this point, it was a pretty standard pattern of how you might design that experience, what you might measure. Just right out of the gate, the things that you might measure for completeness of the project would be things like how many people said yes, how many people said no, did this particular user say yes or no, how many times did they see it, how much time did they spend reading it. And with this project, I had this really neat opportunity to do user research leading up to that dialogue. So there are some questions that folks on the team had around, how do we, can we take this privacy moment that we are required to do, and can we turn it into a positive experience for users? Could we use this as a trust building opportunity? And so given that setup, I then had this opportunity to design in-person videotaped kind of user experience sessions where people of the service came in. They didn't know what we were going to be observing, but they knew they would be kind of testing out a product. And so we had video recordings of folks experiencing this dialogue just in what they thought was a normal internet browsing session. And lo and behold, people don't like these dialogues. Like, they're irritated, they feel resigned, they feel grumpy toward the company, they don't want to be interrupted, it doesn't make sense, all these things. So there's like this huge, rich experience with tons of emotion, both toward like the dialogue, wanting questions, wanting answers, things that are not available, and then what gets rendered is, did this person agree or not? So the thing that was fun about this project was that because somebody else on the team thought it would be neat if we could measure the affect of, kind of understand how people were feeling about the experience, we had videotapes. And me as a privacy person, I knew that people hate privacy policies. I knew that they don't offer you anything interesting. I knew that people felt like I said, pretty grumpy about having to go through this. But the rest of the team didn't know that. And they also didn't know that we had, I don't think it quite clicked, but we deliberately looked at extreme users for this user study, and so we wanted people who were going to have probably, questions about what was happening. So I had a bunch of videos of people experiencing this dialogue. And it was kind of funny because for the people who had never watched or talked a lot with end users about how they feel about data and privacy, they were shocked. They're just like, oh my goodness. Like, usually when I'm talking about the products I build, I'm talking about things like delight and talking about things like how great it is that we're solving this problem for them. But, oh wow, like this has completely changed. Now I see that there's like, this other side of how people are thinking about it. So if all you have is the raw numbers of how many people went through the dialogue, how long it took, whether they said yes or no, you don't get that. And so what I want to encourage you to think about as you're somebody who's working with data is seeking out opportunities so that you can get the broader perspective of what else is going on when the data is collected, so that you could, I would hope that this then leads you to make different decisions, right? It kind of takes lines in a database, it takes entries in the database, all these numbers that you're just kind of like flying through and maybe sometimes getting a little clinical about, seeking out the richer story to it so that you understand, there are people represented here. And there could be a lot more than simply the things that you decided to measure. Another example that I'll throw in, just one that I think is important based on how the past couple of years have gone. 15 years ago, if you were designing a product, you probably wouldn't have thought twice between putting up a binary for something like gender. Yet today, we know that for all that old data that we had, that was simply recorded as a binary, we're doing different today, right? And I feel like some people look at this data and they're like, but wait, we have like decades of data. For as long as we've been collecting data, that's always been a binary. Like, no, somebody's wrong here. Nobody's wrong. Your data is wrong. Your data collection methods were wrong. You're asking the wrong questions. You were giving the wrong options. Once you start to give different options and acknowledge the human experience behind it, your data is different. So 2 examples, right, where what you're looking at is not necessarily reflective of reality. And to my call for asking you to think through, these boundaries that we've put up, considering these boundaries as sometimes being permeable, here's one example. Any opportunity that you can get to observe the mechanism where you're going from kind of messy real life, outside world, down into rendered data, take those opportunities, because I promise you will start thinking about your data much differently if you do. Now, another one that I want to talk about is to seek awareness of the people represented by your data. And think about the context in which they're experiencing the product that they're looking at, and think about how, I guess, kind of like giving yourself the opportunity to be surprised by perhaps your priorities being different from their priorities. So I was working on a product team where we were redesigning the account sign-up flow. So this was back in, I think, like maybe 2014, when a lot of the developing markets were coming online. We had been using email address as the main identifier, but it turns out folks who are coming in to coming online mobile first, their primary identifier is a phone number. Even for folks that are using email as identifier, having a phone number for your identifier is sometimes more straightforward than email. I don't know about you all, but I have on the order of maybe like 10-ish email addresses, and I have like maybe 1 or 2 phone numbers that have been much more stable over time. So there are a lot of reasons as an account provider that you would also offer the option for a phone number account. We thought that this would be a straightforward swap. We thought we knew how to do account registration. One of the things that gets interesting is when you're doing a phone number account, you want to verify that the phone number that person's signing up with is actually their phone number. So you can have different technical abilities to make this easier or slower, kind of go through that verification process. And one of the things that we were looking at was we had a flow where you type in your phone number. Immediately upon that, you receive a text message with a code, enter in your verification, okay, now set your PIN, and then carry on. Now, we got very clever, and for the code to verify that you had the phone number, we went to your text messages and fetched that code for you. So you're looking at the account registration screen, your screen would briefly flip over to text message and then briefly flip back, and then you were on your way. It felt very slick. When we were testing it, it felt very slick. Then we went into the field. So earlier in the deck, I had some pictures of some user research that we did in India. And prior to that trip, we're trying to figure out, like, there is this insane drop-off in the account flow. It's like, why are people not completing this account sign-up form? So, got on a plane, went over to India, did some in-person usability testing, and we asked people to go through the flow using their own phones. So different Android devices, in some cases low-end devices, different networks, and also sometimes different building construction materials. So the network availability would be different. So then we noticed this feature that we thought was slick and convenient and would lead to better completion rates actually was not at all so slick on these different phones and the different network connections. So all of a sudden we're watching people and watching these screens kind of flip back and forth, and it's like, oh, instead it just looks like the phone is being hijacked and like awkwardly jumping around and just doesn't actually make sense. It's like, right, okay, so then in the context, then it's like, okay, we have all this data and we're trying to, now we see more the context of what people are doing paired with the logging stats that we had. And then it was like, oh, okay, right. So here's an example where we're stepping back from thinking both, rethinking what we're going to prioritize. So what we thought we would prioritize would be the speed at which you could get through these screens. And then we realized, right, for account setup, sometimes it might be better to go kind of slow and steady, right? You want to know what you're doing, make sure you get to the next screen, know the difference between the PIN that you're choosing versus this authentication code that we're asking you to enter, and then carry on. And these are things that somehow, when you're just looking at the log data, weren't showing up to us, right? Like we had to go in and get, again, like this rich picture of what was actually happening so we could figure out like, oh, the drop-off rate, that's what's happening there. It's not that people are, remembering that they actually have another account or remembering that they don't actually want an account or, being turned off by something. It was actually, we had made poor assumptions about what was useful and usable in somebody else's context. So always when you're working through these designs and working through, figuring out what to build, seeking awareness of the people is super important. Now, another of the more beautiful questions that I raised earlier, is there an alternative approach, an alternative intervention that might work as well, or in some cases better? So as I mentioned, I'm standing up a new center at the University of San Diego. And so this has led me to be very interested about kind of data usage and privacy conversations that are happening in the San Diego region. San Diego is, I kind of wonder if they're almost like suffering through like a lost season of Parks and Rec with this smart streetlights debacle, because it really hits kind of like all the highlights of a technical solution coming in, pitched by a company, and just going like, things going wrong at every turn. So basically, sometime around 2016, GE approached the sustainability committee within the city of San Diego and said, hey, we have smart streetlights. We could turn on the lights exactly when you need them and save you a bunch of money. It'll be good for efficiency. You could designate San Diego as a smart city. You'll look really cool, and you could use all this data that's collected for other entrepreneurial activities. It'll be great. So off on another path, all of the, everything about the deployment is a bit of kind of like a comedy of errors. The folks who were approving the contract didn't realize what sensors were involved to actually facilitate the features that were being offered. The division within GE that stood up the product had since changed hands and been bought by another company. This company has a different idea of what it means to be a responsible corporate citizen. The third-party API where they're going to stand up this, data that would be a great resource for other companies to build on top of turns out to not actually be implemented. So there are tons of other questions that are not being answered and things that you would expect to be in place that aren't in place. But when I look at the whole situation, I stop and think like, wait a minute. So I grew up in San Diego, and the weather there is so constant that even 20 years after leaving San Diego, I still can't get in the habit of checking the weather. Yet some salesperson convinced the city of San Diego that what they really needed was all these fancy smart devices to figure out exactly when light was needed on the streets of San Diego. Like, maybe they could have just replaced all these streetlights with LED lights and could have got quite a lot of the same benefits. And so I feel like, a lot of things went wrong in the planning of the project, the delivery of the project, the maintenance and deployment of the software that would also be relevant to this conversation of data and how we use it and who knows and what are the protection mechanisms in place. But really, even just from a first step, I think there is a good question to ask of like, do we need smart streetlights in this city at this scale for this cost? Yeah, so while you're thinking about the work that you're doing, always stop and ask yourself a question of like, do we need to be doing this? Sometimes the best way to apply your big, beautiful brain is to maybe decide not to do the thing, which is not necessarily a thing that I've seen a lot on teams that I've been on. So with this talk in mind, and also kind of, this call to action, pointing out this claim that we have a dysfunctional relationship with data, and if we want to really get excited, if we want to deliver on this great, exciting work that we're, hoping to, how will you individually think about rehabilitating your relationship with the data that you work with? So how could you change your work so that you are better situated to connect with the people that are represented by the data that you work with? And also, how can you rethink your work so that you are creating opportunities where you can connect with those moments where the output of your work is having impact in the real world? I think both of these are areas where we could do quite a lot of things differently. I guess like I joked earlier, I'm sorry that I don't have the pixie dust. I don't have a ready-made solution. I think right now we're at a point in time where there's a great opportunity for us all to take an active role in framing the problem and thinking about, what are the related problems that we need to bring into this so that we can then turn on our solutioning brain and start to think, okay, within these boundaries that we're looking at, what can we do differently? And then I'll also add in that, from the stories that I shared where we had what felt like some good wins with the product decisions that we made and the things that we were building, from the perspective of being inside one company without connecting to a broader community and without connecting to kind of a broader context within where we do our work, I feel like there's a very hard ceiling on how much work or how much of an influence you can have as an individual. And so I'd really encourage all of us to think hard about how we could come together as a community to think through what would it take, how could we open up more options and really shape up this problem if we saw it as a shared problem for kind of us as builders and contributors to things that are hopefully contributing to human flourishing, as opposed to how do I do this work as an employee at this company. So I'll leave that as kind of yes, I know a lot of the things I've suggested feel like micro changes. We do need the macro level as well. And I think both of these are exciting opportunities that we could all get together and author together. So with that, I do believe, I want to acknowledge that I've done this work, created a conversation, actually with BIML folks. I felt maybe a little schmaltzy adding y'all on the slide, but I think I should have. I've done a lot of this work thinking through in conversation with folks at Good Research and also with a nonprofit in San Diego called Data Science Alliance. It is an ongoing conversation that I've captured today. I think there's a lot more to add and a lot more to say, and there are probably some things that you might have taken issue with. So here's my contact info. I would love to hear from you if you want to engage in some generative conversations on the topics.
I guess for a lot of us in engineering, privacy is very difficult to understand. And if it's hard for us to understand as builders, I can only imagine how hard it is for normal people to understand. So we have this issue where privacy is already a difficult and thorny issue with a lot of subtlety that people don't get. And then we throw in the idea that machine learning does surprising things that are often done in an inscrutable fashion. So we're not sure how the machine made the inference that it made, but boy, that's useful for a business. Anticipating that it might do that is hard for the businesses too. So, so I find the challenge of privacy in the age of big data and machine learning even kind of harder than it was before, and before it was too hard. And you seem optimistic. Tell me why that is, and you know what can we do to leverage the kind of impact of ML that's happening very quickly to make some quick progress in privacy while we're at it.
I mean, that is a beautiful question. I feel like that's such a great question. And I guess I feel like the way that we have framed our privacy work so far, and a lot of the work that I see being done in industry, is coming from a place of, I feel like it's coming from like a defensive move. So it's coming from a place of like, yes, we use data in our business. We only use data to advance the business goals, and we have done it right. We care deeply about privacy, and we've done it right. Trust us. And in an area like ours where things are moving so quickly, we should all just be really dissatisfied with that answer. So what I would love to see companies doing, and any organization working with data, instead of putting in the work that they're doing to try to convince us that they're doing it right, that they've done it right, I want to see more evidence, more effort put into kind of opening up the decision-making process and being more clear about kind of legible descriptions of how data is collected, how it's stored, how it's being used, so that we have the information available to kind of judge for ourselves as outsiders whether or not they've done it right, so that we can see, are they taking the right steps so that they are on track to getting it right. And the reason why I would prefer to phrase it like that is with the pace of change, with the increases in just how much data is collecting, how much data is collected, how it's being used, like the conversation moves so fast that whether you got it right at the time of deployment doesn't actually matter as much as, you know, later in time when we're figuring out a new way to look at things and having new information, really. Well, what just happened? And for me, an example I think about a lot is what happened with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. So Facebook released their APIs their third-party APIs in like 2007 or 2008. They created a platform so that people could build new apps on top of Facebook. And at the time, it was, you know, I think as from a perspective of kind of openness and data portability, a lot of, you know, the broad idea of that was a really neat idea. So Facebook is, you know, a centralized place for the data. They had a lot of users. So how could they open it up for other companies to come and build? Then with Cambridge Analytica, I feel like what happened with that data, what happened in that situation highlights where decisions went awry. So certain decisions were made in the design of the API that really, even at the time, never should have happened. But in hindsight, I think we could definitely say, like, decision-making, you know, lots of questions there. And the thing that I go back to is that, you know, with Cambridge Analytica, the situation was that there's a group that claimed that there's a group that bought data off of researchers who had designed a, like, personality quiz. And only, I can't remember exactly the numbers. Like, let's say something in like the hundreds or thousands of users installed that application. But the Facebook API was designed such that those people who installed the application could give permission for all of their friends' data to be accessed as well. And so what began as, like, you know, hundreds or thousands of people making a decision to use this survey actually impacted like 80,000 people. And, you know, there are a lot of points in this conversation of what's happened of like, well, that was a mistake. But I feel like this initial design of like, well, why could I as Maritza grant access to all of these people's information just to install this survey, like something's really messed up there. So I feel like changing this conversation about kind of like, or like bringing things back into like the decision making and documenting it, thinking hard about what are the capabilities that we're building into it. Like, I would never claim that the folks who designed the API should have predicted that Cambridge Analytica would then come up, 10 years later and take advantage of the feature and that was going to happen. Like, no, that'd be crazy. I'm not asking anybody to be a fortune teller to predict the future. But, some questions should have been asked at the point where people are deciding to build this API, which is, things like, are these sensible decisions? What might happen if we, allow all of this data to be accessed? What, like I said, this question of like what adverse events might happen and will we be able to detect them? Like that wasn't built in initially. So if you're going to, I guess to kind of like bring it all around, if you want to be really excited about kind of building and contributing and, being future facing with the power and the promise of data, I feel like we have to kind of like take the responsibility side of that too and say, okay, I'm here because the power and promise is exciting, but also like, how do we be sure that things don't go off the rails? And kind of building, you've got to, I guess, pay attention to both sides of it. So, yeah. I think my optimism is just that, like I said, we've built it. We could build things differently. It just takes people getting kind of, maybe I'm hoping my optimism is contagious.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious, what do you think companies or ML designers can do to more effectively communicate how AI is making decisions in these products that people are using?
Yeah, that is a great question. So there has been, I think, some really promising work coming out of some of the academic communities in terms of explainable AI, thinking about how you would kind of solve exactly this design problem. So what I'm thinking is, Gary, maybe when you post the talk, before you do, I'll hand over some references so you can refer to them for the question. But I think really the answer will be, depending on the context in which you're building a solution and what it is you're aiming to solve, the way that you work through kind of speccing out requirements for explainability, I think would heavily depend on the context of use. And so, thinking about, what's the data, what's at stake, what might happen, who are the decision makers, who needs access to various kind of points of information, starting with those big questions, and then finding, then from the academic work, what are some solutions that we could take into kind of approaching this better. And maybe just to suggest, like, I don't think there's probably no one size fits all answer to, like, here's the perfect way to do explainable AI. I think unfortunately we're, as everybody knows, we're kind of, I feel like we're basically already speeding down the highway in a car and trying to put brakes on it. So hard to know exactly which brakes will help you for the turn you're about to take.
Yeah. So earlier you were talking about the seductiveness of solutioning, how people really just focus on the solution and they don't think about the framing of the problem. And the other thing that you were talking about recently was how a person could disclose their information on the personality quiz and then disclose information about their associates, their friends. In that case, it's fairly easy to recognize that one person is disclosing information about other people. The question that I have is there in machine learning, there's also it seems to be very difficult to draw the boundaries of how much information is being disclosed by a person when the person takes an action, or by when a person discloses information and that information is baked into a model. Then additional disclosure may happen from their membership in a group. It could be that a family member has just disclosed genetic information and you have no control over that. How do we handle this problem of not knowing what the boundaries of disclosure are?
I mean, really the answer is like, we can't know, right? We can't predict the future, and we are learning as we go. And so this is where I do think it's, the kind of one of our best strategies, maybe it's two things, to invest more in the communication of what's been collected, what is being done, what is the system at various points in time, so that at a later point in time, if an adverse event has happened, you could then inspect and go back and do introspection to figure out, well, what happened, so that you can turn it into a learning moment and hopefully not repeat the same mistakes in the future. So I feel like that's one thing. And then also, I mean, since you brought in the example of genetic data, I mean, the time is ripe for us to have, I think, a more mature conversation about the limits of individual consent, and also to think harder about kind of what is needed in terms of kind of societal considerations around what is acceptable and what's not. I think so far we've seen a lot of these decisions being made by industry and also being pushed forward by simply what is possible, what can you build. If you can build it, you can do it, and we'll just see what happens. And I feel like we've seen enough now that it's time to stop doing that. So, and kind of exactly the form that takes, I think, is to be determined. Yeah, I would love if folks have ideas on kind of what we need to do going forward.
Yeah, I think what I was actually trying to articulate is what you articulated in the limits of individual consent. It also ties into some of the other aspects of discussion related to who's making these decisions and can they effectively make them.
Maybe machines, the algorithms themselves should have privacy rights. Kind of collective privacy rights.
Today, I feel like they have more privacy rights than any of us.
They might, yeah, because they are
Only
owned
like
by
de
a
facto.
corporation. Yeah,
That's right.
they're trying
Yeah,
to
that's the
protect-
corporate secret sauce.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this talk. It was very nice to hear what you had to say.
Thanks for having me.
Treated me like something that you left behind to stay. Now I'm not sure that I can give a damn.